Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel on the future of trade, policy shifts, and regional impacts. This is a great panel because everyone here is really nice and has been a friend of mine for either everything from a few minutes to years, and so I know a little bit how good this discussion is going to be. You'll be glad you came. I also know that it comes at that point in the afternoon where that lovely lunch and all the snacks kind of wear you down. It's not yet time to drink, so you can't get too worked up. So just this, we're going to give you a stimulating discussion, which will hopefully get you through the afternoon. Let me introduce the panel to you. On the far end, I'll say that way because right and left don't work if it's me or you. We have the Honorable Sir. Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So on the far left, we have the Honorable Rick Glumac, who is the Minister of State for AI and New Technologies in the Government of British Columbia. Very glad to have you, Minister. We then have Dan Utso, who you saw on an earlier panel today. He is a senior counsel with Thompson Hine Law Firm. Then we have Allison Gifford. Allison, I've known for a long time. She's now Vice President for Policy and Public Affairs of Clear Strategy, consultancy and all-around helper of people. And then to my immediate right, we have Spencer Cohen, who is he's the principal and founder of High Peak Strategies. And so all of these individuals are either involved in governing or are involved in advising those who govern to try to get the trade and foreign policy shifts right. So I think you've got a great set of ears to hear from. Let me turn to you, Rick, first, to sort of talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the region and what you think regional impacts of some of this have been. Oh. I can give you mine.
Okay.
That's great.
Thank you so much. So good to be here today. I think this is my 8th PNWER summit that I've been to. I've taken on this role as BC's delegate from the beginning since I was elected in 2017. So very glad to be here today. And I see we have our Minister of Agriculture, Lana Popham, here today from British Columbia. And are there any others? Gavin Dew over there. He's doing his Instagram right now. And yeah, as of Friday morning, I was BC's Minister of State for Trade. We had a cabinet shuffle, and now I am BC's Minister of State for AI and New Technologies. Very excited about that role, but today we're going to be talking mostly about trade. And I guess my perspective on the panel is around the conversations that I've been having with a lot of the businesses that I've been talking to in British Columbia, some in the U.S. as well. We did a trip down here a few months ago. The general feeling out there, as you may well guess, is this feeling of chaos and this feeling of wanting to take action to firm up their businesses. Not necessarily just waiting to hear what's going to happen between the U.S. and Canada, but the chaos itself, just the uncertainty of the situation, is causing some real challenges with businesses, and they're wanting to diversify into new markets. In British Columbia, in particular, we are the least trade exposed to the United States in Canada. 54% of our exports come into the United States. 35% go to Asia. We are exporting a lot to Asia, 10% to the rest of the world. So I can talk a little bit about some of the stuff that our government is doing to support our businesses to take some of that pressure off, to find new markets. And at the same time, we really value our relationship with the United States. BC in particular has a very close relationship with Washington State, and we continue to build on that. We have Lieutenant Governor Denny Heck. He is here today. We've been working together to put together an interparliamentary group where we can exchange ideas and work together on things. And the work we're doing in PNWER also is helpful for that. So I'm excited to talk about all of this today and learn from all of you. And so thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dan, do you want to situate yourself in the conversation and give us sort of an opening?
Yeah. I think I ran my big mouth a lot this morning, so I'll let or ask others to jump in on some of the more specific trade things. But the same points that were just touched on and that we heard this morning is that every conversation all day long. I mean, it's 24/7 with companies is what's going to happen. Obviously everybody wants to know, and how do we even begin to price, how do we even begin to plan? For the most part, companies have passed through the tariffs. Now that doesn't mean, so often when we hear consumers, we think I do all the grocery shopping in my house, right? We think we're paying for that as the consumer. No, that's not really how it works, right? It gets passed through the supply chain, and we're doing splits, and we're doing a lot of tariff splitting. Like, some of the funny things is clients will call and say, well, our supplier overseas says they'll just pick up the cost of the tariffs, and we're like, that means that's a state-owned enterprise. That's usually the first tip off that's like a Chinese company that's saying, oh, we'll just pick off the tariffs, we don't care. It's like, yeah. But then the others are, oh, we've seen all kinds of things that happen when these roll out. Oh, well, our supplier will give us an invoice for customs purposes, which is different from the invoice that we're actually using for our customer. Like, yeah, whenever somebody says we'll give you two different invoices, call your lawyer first before deploying that strategy. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. But that has been a lot of the activity that's going on right now. And in contrast to when the tariffs came on in Trump 1.0, and it is, as I emphasized this morning, the Biden administration continued all that. The only difference, frankly, in the two strategies was the Biden administration added an industrial policy. So Trump 1.0 put a fortress tariff wall around, at least vis-a-vis China, and on steel and aluminum, and then USMCA. The Biden administration continued all that. In fact, ratcheted it up in many cases, and then added forced labor as part of the worker-centric trade. With forced labor is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, wonderful merits behind it, but it is the most draconian customs rule we have. If US CBP pulls that over and says we think that was made with forced labor in China, you're guilty until you can prove innocent, and good luck with that. Right. So those things are just sitting in warehouses at ports right now. And it started with cotton products, apparel products, and now it's moving into the automotive sector, et cetera. And when you still meet with DHS right now, they'll tell you that's their number one priority. Right. So all of those things are going on. But the Biden administration, as I said earlier, added the Infrastructure Act. But that didn't come with tariffs, but it came with Build America, Buy America, which prior to the tariffs was the greatest threat to Canadian manufacturing, because as the rules were rolled out, it was very difficult for Canadian companies, manufacturers, to meet the Build America, Buy America. So the universe of projects that were getting federal financial assistance, as that term's defined, broadband, anything to do with renewable energy, et cetera, all of those things, they now came with rules that basically precluded Canadian companies from, even with the exceptions in the WTO procurement agreement and all those kinds of things, didn't apply to BABA. And so there was already kind of a tariff on, it was actually a prohibition in many ways. So many Canadian manufacturers were already saying, we got to set up shop in the US. Or can you find us a partner that we can do a JV with in the United States to help us make that rule? And that was happening before Trump. The Inflation Reduction Act, same thing. The Inflation Reduction Act, whether it was EV, solar, et cetera, had rules that had domestic content. Now, most of those were plus ups. You got extra credit. But in some cases, they prohibited manufacturing from outside the United States. Now, Canada was pretty shrewd on the battery side and was able to get some access there. And then we had the CHIPS Act, the Semiconductor Act. Those were the things that the Biden administration did, but it was already going to be tough for Canadian companies to compete in that market. Now you look at what President Trump did, and I said earlier, and this is where I'll end, is it's the 3 R's, right? It's the rebalancing agenda, which is we're still doing steel, and we're still doing automotive, and we now are doing copper, semiconductors, lumber, pharma. Those will all be out by the end of the month, by the way. Those reports. And then now we have a bunch of new ones behind that, aerospace, UAVs, et cetera, that are coming down the pike. That's the real trade agenda. And then it's these cutting deals. And I remember when the Obama administration wanted to do the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the TTIP, the deal with Europe, Transatlantic Trade Investment. They would do roundtables in Ohio and that state north of Ohio that we don't say the name of with Detroit, but because they had to sell it, right? If they were going to do a trade deal, they'd have to sell it in our neck of the woods and out here as well, because it was going to benefit here. But they would send these people from the Commerce Department, from State Department, and all of the companies in the room would say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. But you know what we really need to do? We need to do what other countries are doing. We need to subsidize. We need to put tariff walls up. We need to do all this stuff because that's who we're competing against. And if you fast forward to today, I always think about those roundtables. I used to call to the administration back then and say, this isn't selling, and if you want this to sell as kind of a counterbalance to China, send us somebody in brass. We need that general, that man or woman that's got a bunch of medals saying, if we don't do this, we need China's going to take us over, right? Like that's the only way you were going to sell it in the Midwest. But I think about that all the time, because if you look at the reciprocal trade agenda, there's nothing reciprocal about it, as I said earlier. It's doing exactly what the U.S. wanted to do in TPP. Have those other countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, et cetera, lower their tariffs, remove non-tariff barriers, agree to buy a bunch of stuff from us, soy, airplanes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then handle some other things. Because when this administration negotiates, they don't negotiate like we're all trained as trade lawyers or lawyers generally, like we define the issues and we stay in our lanes. And it's Michael Corleone when you're negotiating here. They're going to settle all the family's business. We got a problem on NATO. We got a problem over here. Let's talk about that while we're at the table. And part of that's the speed with which they're moving. And that to me, and then there's this revenue function. And to me, that's what's holding all these deals up. Because the U.S. administration is saying they like the tariff revenue that we're bringing in. They don't really care where the source is. But other countries aren't going to agree to do that part of it. So it's kind of rebalancing as ally shoring, friend shoring, whatever we wanted to call it, but actually with teeth to it. And then you have the reciprocal trade, which is kind of like the president's baby because he's cutting deals. And if any of you have ever worked for a boss, not to put any of the government officials on the spot, but let's just say you were a chief of staff to somebody. And we all know like there's things that the boss really likes to do, but may not be the most important thing. And you're like, well, at least I can keep him or her busy over there with that. That's kind of what's happening in the trade world right now. It's like the rebalancing agenda, the 232s are the real trade strategy. The other thing is like, let the president go play with that, go play with the reciprocal trade agenda, and he'll cut some deals. The problem is when everybody thinks they have a deal, they bring it back to the boss and he's like, I'm gonna squeeze a little bit more out of it. And I'm going to get that extra 10%. And we're going to see in the next 2 or 3 weeks if he's going to keep squeezing. My suspicion is he won't, but who's going to give first? So,
Rick, you don't have your chief of staff here to hear this story. Oh dear. Okay. Don't do it like Dan said. Allison.
Thanks, Chris. Allison Gifford. I'm based in Ottawa. Been in Ottawa since 2008. And I came into the trade world kind of by accident. I've always been a government relations lobbyist type person. And I ended up working for UPS, oh gosh, like 10 years ago. I spent about 10 years working for US multinationals. So I worked for UPS for 5 years and Amazon for 3, so I guess that's just 8 years. But I ended up getting a very applied sense of trade about supply chains and ports and movement of goods, because if you work for UPS or Amazon, time in transit is everything. So I started to understand quite early supply chains and trade agreements, probably more than I would say the political class in Ottawa cared, because supply chains used to be really nerdy. And now we're cool, but it used to be pretty dorky. And I think there's a lot of changes I've noticed in the last 10 years. I think, I made a living almost being one of the few lobbyists who understood the movement of goods, because a lot of folks were so preoccupied with domestic politics and the ping pong of politics and not looking at the movement of their goods and all of the risks that they might be subject to. That has really changed. And the amount of supply chain conversations that I have with clients now is delightful to me. But it's so much more prevalent, and it's something that everyone needs to understand now. Canada's a funny bunny. I think, having worked for US companies for a long time and loving it, I honestly, it's what I've made my living out of. It's what I enjoy. I like our relationship with the United States, and I like working in trade diplomacy a lot. But Canada's had an interesting point of view over the last couple of years, I think. One thing that we don't realize in Canada is that the US refer to us as Canada and LATAM. We always think we're just, the equal. But our population's not getting bigger, our market's not getting bigger. And so we don't necessarily have the leverage or the heft that maybe we always think we do. And I think that combined with just like the political malaise that happened in Canada leading up to Trump 2.0 had us in not great shape. So some examples I'll give you, and I'm Canadian, so I can do this. But I do think we should have some tough love on the Canadians, and I feel as a Canadian who loves Canada, I can do that. So one thing I'll say is the 44th Parliament, the last session of the 44th Parliament, our political leadership got absolutely nothing done. They couldn't pass legislation. They just fought over domestic issues and winning. It was incredibly toxic. It was incredibly unproductive. And that culminated into the most cynical set of tax cuts coming from Prime Minister Trudeau that weren't means tested. And our finance minister ended up walking off the job because she said, we're going into a trade war, guys. We need a buffer. Don't give away money at Christmas so that people don't pay tax on beer. Literally. So you could just see our own government falling apart before our eyes. And we entered this trade war with no prime minister. So this is so different from the first time of Trump 1.0, where taco was real. Taco happened, but we also had this Team Canada. It was cross-partisan. There was a charm offensive. We didn't even have a prime minister. So it was like our pants were down. And I think the other thing is just how Canada sees itself, and we have become as a nation very risk averse. And I think that is not the right mindset when you're dealing with a geopolitical realignment that is not just a given that democracy is the best thing and that we all are saving the day together and, that there's no collateral damage countries like us. We were thinking about that. We were thinking about fighting with provinces. And I think one thing, if you're American, one thing you have to appreciate about Canada is the United States, the states maybe don't have the individuality that provinces do. Our provinces can gum up our entire federal government. And so that was also, the focus was on so much domestic stuff that we just weren't looking where we should be looking. I think the other thing that we really learned is the problem with virtue signaling. And I have no problem with our last Prime Minister Trudeau, nice guy, but he loved to virtue signal. And he did that to Trump all the time. And it just wasn't helpful. He almost enjoyed biting his thumb at Trump. And I don't think that's how we needed to be on everything. I also think, to your point about, the Biden administration taking the Trump administration's China policy, Biden tried to tell us, cough up some money for defense, get rid of your DST. This is not all Trump. This was happening before. And we weren't listening, and we were being very stubborn and very beholden to domestic interests and not changing. And not thinking about a nose to tail, industrial policy or strategy. So our IP was leaving the country. We were vulnerable going into this. The good news is, I really do think the silver lining for Canadians is this has made us think much more globally and much more shrewdly. I think we've always been good negotiators. However, I do think that, I was at WICHIT here a couple of months ago, and one of the WICHIT, the Washington Center for Council for International Trade. It was lovely. It was here in Seattle. But I remember talking to the winemakers, and they said, we went down to BC and we couldn't believe how mad you guys are. And you guys probably saw that New York Magazine article that says Canadians are pretty pissed off or something along those lines with the big beaver with the scary teeth. But anyway, it's true. And I think in the US, you guys are just dealing with so many things at once, but for Canadians, this fundamentally changed our identity and our sense of nationalism. So don't underestimate that if you're doing diplomacy with the Canadians. Nobody admits if they're going to Florida anymore for vacation. Nobody says they're going to the United States, and if they do, they have to apologize for it because we're Canadian. We apologize for everything. But it's really, really fundamentally altered our sense of a nation, of ourselves as a nation, and we took for granted how much we'd always have the U.S. there. I think that's really changed. But one of the things I was saying to the vintners is yes, we're mad at you, but also that's nice that we could buy your wine. I can't buy wine from British Columbia and I live in Ontario. Have you ever had Ontario wine? Tastes like cheese. It's disgusting. So like, that's all we can get because we are so protectionist, even interprovincially, that we can't get that together. And like, it's a problem for our own economy, but it's a problem for foreign investment. So all of that to say, this has been a bit of awakening. Yes, Canadians are pissed. Were Canadians too complacent? Probably. Do Canadians really think about their role internationally and geopolitically? Not always. So this has been a good moment in some ways for us. And my job is really just trying to keep continuity with business and business investments in Canada and ensuring that the politics don't overtake the fact that US companies still create Canadian jobs. And we can't lose sight of that.
Spencer.
Hey, everybody. Spencer Cohn, Principal Founder, High Peak Strategy. I'm a professional economist, but an economic geographer by training. So I've always had a deep interest in trade and supply chains. And on top of that, I spent a lot of time in China. So I did my dissertation work there, language study, lived there. So I've always had a deep fascination with China and with US-China relations. And that brought me back when I came back to the States. Really found myself involved a lot in the relationship between US and China, and particularly the regional ties. So how much China really matters to the Pacific Northwest. And so I have some numbers I wanted to share with you just to kind of level set and frame a little bit some of the relationship. Before I do so, I do want to highlight two things. One is that when we think about the relationship and the importance of China and the PNW, inclusive of the PNWER region, the 10 states and provinces, there's really two main vectors I think of with respect to cargo, at least. One is that China for a long time has been a major trading partner and export market for the PNW. Now we can talk about rebalancing. We can talk about a lot of issues around imbalances with respect to imports and exports. But at least for the PNW, there's no way to actually measure this, but we intuitively know that we do run a so-called surplus. So we export a lot more goods to China. So it's been a major market. And it's not just aircraft, which is a big one, although there was a moratorium on aircraft purchases for a couple of years. That's beginning to pick up again of Boeing aircraft. But household goods, agricultural products. We know that Canada, Western Canada, is a major producer of fuel sources, of grain, of forestry products, and so forth. And those oftentimes get shipped to China. In the U.S., in the PNW as well as in Alaska, we're major exporters of seafood products. Oftentimes they get processed in China and then shipped back to the U.S. That's why when you go to Costco and you buy filleted salmon, it was probably actually packed and probably filleted in China, even though it was caught in Alaska. But also frozen potato products, cherries, fruits, wheat, all kinds of products, lots of machinery products. So China has been a major market. So any rupture or decline in that trade will have a direct impact on our region. So just a really rough estimate I put together was for the PNWER region, so the 10 states and provinces, last year we exported, and this is stuff that originates from the region, roughly about $29 billion worth of goods. That does not include services. That doesn't include when Chinese people come to the US or to Canada to spend their income on tourism or education and other expenditures or services. So $29.1 billion. Roughly about 24 billion if you strip out aerospace, but still a pretty sizable number. However, in the last 5 months, which is the most recent data we have, so the first 5 months year to date, so through the first 5 months of 2025 versus the same period in 2024, it's leveled off relatively. It's a little bit, increased a little bit, but the story is really different between the US and Canada and specifically between our provinces and states. So US, if you take away aerospace, which I always do that because aerospace is such a unique character and there's so many other factors that play into shipments of aircraft. If you take out aerospace, through the first 5 months of this year, exports from Alaska, Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Oregon fell by about 18%. So pretty sizable drop. We think a lot of that is most likely due to China's own moratoriums on grain purchase with respect to unproductive zombie debt that gets rolled over. You're seeing historically now since about 2009, the GDP ratio for non-financial keep on climbing, which means that for every new renminbi of debt that gets issued, it generates less output in the economy. The real estate market as part of that is really in shambles right now, and more data is coming in about how much that's really seizing up. And they have a demography issue. They don't have enough workers. They had negative population growth last year. They are integrating as much automation technology as possible to the leading driver or consumer of automation technology, but that it's unclear how much that will be able to soak up all that additional demand. So if China falters economically, as it likely will to some degree, that's also going to have an impact on our export markets as well in the long run. So I'll pause there. I'm sure we'll have more to talk about.
No, that's fantastic. You can see we've got quite a universe to cover. I want to turn back to you, Rick, if I can, because there are all these different sectors, and one of the ones that you're now responsible for in your new job is tech. And this region is famous for the Cascadia Corridor project, the high-tech companies in Seattle, Vancouver, and in the region. How do we think about that kind of trade, right? When people have either a personal dislike of crossing the border, or maybe they just really don't feel comfortable. What happens to that kind of dynamic, and what does that mean to the region if we start seeing that kind of relationship break down?
Yeah, I mean, in BC, we export approximately $37 billion of services. And $54 billion worth of goods. So our export of services, digital services, and things like that is very high, and that's growing, I think, 13% from the previous year. So we're seeing that continue to grow. We have so many tech companies, and in fact, we're importing 22 billion. So we do have more services actually coming out of British Columbia than coming in. But we do have so many amazing tech companies in this region. British Columbia, Vancouver is one of the fastest growing tech hubs in Canada right now. And there's a lot of work that we're doing to support that sector. I don't see it. I don't see it. I mean, there's no so far tariff on services, and I mean, there was talk about putting a tariff on movies and things like that, but nobody seems to understand how that would work. And I don't see that being as negatively affected, obviously. And so this is the kind of thing that we can still continue to do and collaborate to grow our trade of services between the U.S. and Canada. So I think that's one positive that is continuing to grow and hopefully continues to grow.
I'm going to follow up on that with a question about real estate. I was reading in a Canadian journal not that long ago, someone who said the Canadian economy cannot just keep selling condos to people forever. How is the housing situation in Vancouver, and is it a limit to growth? And particularly when many condos are owned by people who are not Canadian, maybe Chinese or elsewhere. How is that dynamic playing out in BC's economy?
Well, there's no doubt that the real estate sector is a very important sector to BC's economy. But we've been having this challenge as Washington has and many other places have, that our real estate prices are so high. You know, we put a lot of effort in to try to take some of the speculation out of the market. If you look at real estate prices historically, it just ballooned up in a few years. Late 2010s in particular, I think. And so we put in a speculation tax in order to try to sort of deal with the speculation component, because I think 50% of the condos were not being bought by the people that are going to live in them, but they were renting them out. And you know, some level of that is great. We want to have rental places for people to rent, because our rents were also very high, and the vacancy rates are very low and all of that. So we've actually made a lot of progress on that front. You know, we have a ban on Airbnbs in a lot of areas in British Columbia right now, and we wanting to see those spaces go back into the rental pool for long-term rentals. So, you know, we are facing this situation now where there is a cool down for sure, and we certainly have to be very conscious of what impact that'll have on our economy. At the same time, we also want to create more affordability for people, but not to have it like suddenly dive down. We want it to sort of level off and create some affordability over time. So it's something that we're looking very closely at. There's been a lot of work on this front around the housing ministry, the work that we've been doing. So it's a very important area of our economy, and we're continuing to build on the work we're doing there. So.
Excellent. Dan, I'm going to go to you next. One of the things I remember about the first Trump administration was a meeting that was held during the USMCA, we thought NAFTA renegotiation at the time, with Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. And Wilbur Ross made a proposal in the auto sector, where great Midwestern business, that we do full traceability down to raw materials in the supply chain. And the auto companies fought that off. They weren't convinced that our rule of origin certificate system was that reliable beyond, say, tier 2 or 3, and nobody wanted the liability. But since then, there's been a lot of discussion about the application of machine learning and blockchain to try to get a better picture. When you talked about trade, you talked about Chinese goods, and Spencer kind of talked about transshipment being maybe a new factor. How close are we to a supply chain system in which we really apply technology to know that there's no forced labor, to know that there's no bad things, so that the Gen Z consumer can buy what their values want, and that the institutional investor can invest in something they feel is comfortable with their investment guidelines?
Yeah, I think we're getting there, but we're still ways away, right? The technology is there, but it's still going to have to rely on the inputs in, right? So, not to keep going back to China, but if I want to go get a certificate from China that it's not made in the Uyghur areas, I'm going to get one. They're experts at giving you that certificate that says that. And so at some point, and I'm doing this right now with an agricultural product that we won an anti-dumping countervailing duty case on some goods coming, agricultural products from India, which is kind of the everyday thing. It's always China and India. We're always, it's just whack-a-mole. And then as soon as I'll get that order, very powerful tool, all of a sudden we saw those imports of the same product from Africa. And who were the companies? It's all they did was pick up the machinery for processing equipment from India and park it into African countries. And we see those numbers. And now we're bringing another case on that. And we show the data. We're like, it is impossible to grow this much in that region, right? Well, but they go out there and they get the farmers to say in Nigeria and Ethiopia and places like that, oh yeah, we're growing that much. We're like, it's humanly impossible to grow that much. We have the GPS mapping that shows all the acreage. So it's just one big game of whack-a-mole. But you hit on two things that I think are really important is, to me, in the deals that we're seeing come through, the fine print is going to be on transshipment. And you see the president will say things like, well, Vietnam agreed to a deal, still a little unclear if they agreed, but that it'll be 20% tariffs on Vietnam and 40% for transshipment. That actually doesn't make any sense. Because transshipment, if we know something is transshipped, let's say it's a China product that goes to Vietnam but it still is Chinese, like not enough substantial transformation was done in Vietnam to make that a product of Vietnam. We don't put Vietnam's duties on there. We just say that's a product of China at that point, right? And then it gets all the China duties, which was said earlier, right now is on average about between 50 and 60%. It's much higher if it's covered by anti-dumping. It could be 300, 400%. In some areas. That's why, to the earlier point, everybody got out of China last time and went to Mexico and Vietnam. That's why we're talking about transshipment. What I think is going to happen, and we're in a very aggressive discussions with the administration right now, like, what are you guys planning on doing, is that there may not be enough done in Vietnam to make it a product, or there is enough done in Vietnam or Indonesia or wherever. So it'll become a product of those countries. So it's actually complying with all the rules and it'll pay the Vietnamese tariffs, but there's going to be a separate test. Is it 20% Chinese product? Is it 30% still Chinese? So under our normal rules, it counts as the new third country. But if it's got that much, you're going to pay a higher set of duties, which in some cases may be right about what you would pay if it was China. So that's, to me, what we have known was the price of admission to get a seat at the table for one of these deals. And that's where the fine print is. And that's where Canada's already way ahead of the curve. Canada, Allison made a great point earlier. Canada, when we did in 17, and I'm a Canada-US guy, 25 years. I've dedicated my life to this relationship, not as long as my boyish-looking friend at the end of here. Boy, he's way older than me, by the way. But my big brother here. But the reality is, Canada was waving the banner of free trade. We can't have quotas. We can't have these things. And the U.S.'s position was like, the China threat's worse for you than it is to us. If we can't take on China, do you think you can? Right? You know, and so get on board, and everybody kind of came in kicking and screaming, and we ended up with a pretty good deal in USMCA. It's actually a masterful deal. But since that time, Canada's done a lot on steel and aluminum. It did a lot on electric vehicles and took some hits for that. And so if any country in the world is kind of prepared for this transshipment issue, it's Canada, right? Now, there still are some things done. We saw the Prime Minister just made some announcements on steel and aluminum last week, and it's done under the banner of this is how we're going to help the domestic industry. Yeah, that's kind of true. It's also because the US is asking for that, right? So it's a way to give some cover to some of the quotas and things like that. So to me, I think that's the most important thing we'll see over the next month. Like, to me, the most important deal is, what does that Vietnam deal look like? Because Vietnam's economy is about 80% driven by China, right? And so how are they going to agree to be with us? But it goes back to Spencer's point, is that now if we're going to isolate China, we need to still be able to sell that ag somewhere else. And Vietnam's, and that's why they've agreed to buy that ag. And so Indonesia is going to agree. So there's a method to the madness here. It's just tough to always see. And let's just face it, this administration does not communicate its trade strategy very well. If you listen and you know what they're saying, you're like, okay, that makes sense. But the president then will get out there and say, well, 40% for transshipment. It's like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Or, you know, or they're paying the bill, or whatever the hell he's saying that day. You know what I mean? So that's the issue. But I think that is one of the most important things going forward. Chris, before we go, I do want to touch on domestic at some point, but we can come back to that.
Come back to domestic, but I'm going to go to you, Allison, because I think one of the things we learned in the first Trump administration, I think it was a journalist, Selena Zito, who observed that it was important to take Trump seriously, but not always literally. And I do find some of the things that he said have created kind of an interesting, well, it's an interesting point. I'm not sure I agree with his solution, but it's an interesting point. So my first question for you is about fentanyl. And the president raised de minimis, which I was used to being, well, what's the low threshold for applying tariff? And it was kind of a small business issue. But the de minimis threshold for inspecting packages and how we inspect packages, because fentanyl can move in those. And you were at UPS, FedEx, DHL, they're all facing the same problem. Is it possible for the industry to sit around a table and say, okay, here's the level, here's the best technology that we can all agree to bear. It could become a new standard and we'll do that. Or is this going to be one of those things where small packages become one of the big bones of contention? And because we can't figure out a way to inspect. We don't inspect every container. We maybe don't inspect every FedEx package or UPS package, but we have to do better. The president's not wrong that there's a fentanyl conduit there. So that's my first question to you. And I have a second one, but I'll just let you start with that one. It's a bit nerdy.
No, it's good. I love a de minimis question. So when we entered into the last rounds of USMCA negotiations, there was a huge gap in reciprocity on de minimis. The threshold, if you were in the United States and you were ordering something from outside of the United States, you could get it duty and tax-free up to $800. In Canada, you could get it duty-free up to 40 and tax-free up to 20. No, it was just 20. Just duty and tax-free up to $20. So imagine what that buys you. So after a lot of drama on the Canada side, because the provinces didn't want to give up the revenue, we ended up increasing it to, I believe now it's 40 tax-free and 150 duty-free, something in that environ. But anyway, I think that my issue really is that in Canada, and this is I'm going to answer your nerd with a nerd.
Okay.
Our goods come through in two different streams. They come from a courier stream and a postal stream. What you may not know is that we have absolutely no control over the postal stream. There's no checks and balances for Canada Post. So I guarantee you it's all coming from Canada Post. Couriers are subject to a very high and rigorous compliance regime, and they are like 98%. So I actually think it's a postal issue and not necessarily a small package issue. That said, I remember CBP, oh gosh, I don't know if this is still active, but like 8 or 9 years ago, you guys had a really good e-commerce strategy, like a 21st century e-commerce strategy for small package, because we do have to deal with the fact that our goods are moving in these tiny packages now. Canada was supposed to have one, CBSA was supposed to have one, we still don't have one. So like the whole concept of how we manage our borders around e-commerce has not changed sufficiently, nor have we invested in modernizing it. So, we've made small gains. Like my friend Solomon here, we were together when we got rid of like wet ink signatures on power of attorney, things like that. But that's not enough for the sheer volume of small packages that are coming through. But I do think it's a postal issue more than anything.
Excellent. I'm always glad when somebody goes postal and everyone's still okay at the end. All right, so here's my next question, and this goes to maybe it kind of builds on what we've been talking about. I always felt that Canada-US free trade had been discussed, but Canada came proposing NAFTA. Mulroney came, wanted to be involved. That Canada's at its best when it's had a chance to think about things, take on the various concerns, and then get creative about how we could create a system to make this work. Whatever the Americans are complaining about, come up with a way that might address that. And the USMCA negotiation, Canada was on the back foot the whole time. And although Dan's obviously right about some of what the president's strategy is, I feel like the president has been his own worst enemy in creating an atmosphere in which it's very difficult for Canada to come forward with bright ideas and help solve problems. It looks as though a prime minister who made the digital services tax go away, who agreed to spend 2% on defense and more, who addressed border security with Bill C-2, lots of new things, has done what was asked of him and has tried to make it work, is getting nothing for it, or not getting much. No offense to the ambassador if he's still here, but just that idea that he's trying and he's keeping a good face, but he's got a minority government only by 1 vote, but still a minority. How long will Canadians put up with the attempt to make nice when it gets us nowhere? And where's the threshold? And can we ever get that Canadian, hey, we're cheerful, we can help solve problems, back at the table? Because I think it would be great for all 3 countries, but especially for the US.
So many questions. So C2 seemed more like, please jump in, guys, if I'm wrong, but C2 just seemed like reciprocity with the United States.
And arming the Coast Guard, that was nice.
And arming the Coast Guard. So like, I don't know, I had a lot of clients come to me and be like, search and seizure, oh my God. But it really did seem like reciprocity. Like the United States has been like, look, if we have a sex offender entering our country, can you just let us know? And we'd be like, no, so there is that. So the other piece is the DST. I think that Carney was giving that to Trump as a win. I think the execution was horrible because you only whip out the drama in trade agreements when you actually think you're going to get something or you're so close. Like Freeland did it brilliantly with CETA when she came out and she did like her Italian opera on the steps, but then she got something. Whereas our finance minister came out and was like, no way, are we giving up the DST? And then we gave it up 2 days later. So like, I just don't think that the choreography was great around that, but everyone expected that to happen. That was low hanging fruit. That said, I think that this is about a fundamental realignment of American manufacturing. So you can talk to us about fentanyl all you want. And yes, the precursors do come from the Canadian side, but I think that we have done our part, but I don't think that this is going to create the realignment of like a steel industry back to the United States. So I think that that's really the MO. I don't know, come at me if you don't agree, but that seems to be like to me.
Very, very good answer. Spencer, you're our panelist who has really given us a window on China. And in one of the earlier discussions, we talked about the issue of the president wanting to put a fee on Chinese owned or ships on. This is a very integrated region. It's a gateway region. How does that impact this region? Do we see trade diversion or shipment diversion to the Canadian ports? How do you see that unfolding?
I like to borrow a Tom Friedman line that Trump often snuffs out the right question, but gives the wrong answer or the very wrong answer sometimes. I think that he's right. And I think that we have allowed our shipbuilding industry to really become so narrowly focused on small vessels, on littoral vessels, and then within the Jones Act with the sort of short sea and Jones Act vessels. One but the way that the fee was originally proposed, and to be clear too, the investigation that led to the initial draft ruling, which is actually not the ruling that's in place now, was initiated under the Biden administration, under Section 301. So they're looking at unfair trade practices, subsidies, other kinds of unfair practices that led to China's dominance of the shipbuilding industry. So China, as of last year, in terms of new gross tonnage or committed gross tonnage, represented about 75% of all new vessel construction. And just, from there down, it's, South Korea is like a fraction of that, and then Japan, and then the US and India and Indonesia are like practically nil, at this point, other than like for own domestic needs. So, and the concern, as China's been rapidly expanding its Navy, beginning to really threaten sort of U.S. positions and U.S. sort of, position in Western Asia, is a good call to arms to reinvest in our shipbuilding industry. This also ties with the broader concerns about port security. We also saw there's discussions now about 100% tariff on Chinese-built cranes, which represent about 80% of all gantry ship-to-shore cranes in the U.S. So there is a lot of concern on that. With respect to the fee, though, so the initial fee that went out, the initial draft fees were quite severe and punitive and draconian. So they talked about, if it's a Chinese-built vessel, if you're an ocean carrier who owns these vessels, and there's a formula for how much was of your fleet, how much it constituted. If it's 50% of your fleet is Chinese-built versus 75, that it would be roughly $500,000 up to $1.5 million per port call. And that would have been devastating for U.S. ports on the West Coast, particularly because if it would be so cost prohibitive to make a port call, you would have to reduce the number of port calls. So you'd probably, you'd still go to the U.S. West Coast, but you'd probably only go to LA Long Beach. You would not go to Seattle, or you dramatically reduce the number of port calls to Seattle. You would definitely go to Vancouver and Rupert instead, and you'd figure out ways to do that. So that was kind of a non-starter, and there was a massive amount of uproar among ports, particularly ports on the West Coast. Just like they met with the administration, I think in March, and like, hey, this is really not a good idea. So the administration came back, USTR came out with a new rule that's going to go into effect in October. And that rule is a far less punitive. It's still punitive, but it's a far less punitive rule. And they differentiate between Chinese operators of Chinese vessels and non-Chinese operators that utilize Chinese vessels. And that is now based on tonnage. It actually starts at 0. So it phases in over time. It starts at 0, but it phases in beginning October. And it's based on tonnage and or container. So there's different fee structure. It's still a cost. And I think that the concern is that, and I'm not trying to sow division at PNWER because we want to be unified here, but there have been lots of studies that have shown that if you move a container, 40-foot container through a Canadian BC port, it's about $1,400 cheaper than moving it through Seaport Alliance because of the HMT, which I know is the dirty word you can't say at PNWER. But we do know that there is already, or harbor maintenance tax. So we do know that there's already a cost disadvantage. So anything you do to increase that cost disadvantage is viewed worrisomely by the ports. That said, I think that there are other challenges too. I agree with the purpose and motivation behind trying to address this issue of investing in shipyard capacity. The problem is that, if you talk to a lot of the shipyards in the U.S., one is cost. You can't compete even with South Korea and Japan on cost on a unit basis. They're so much better at it for the large scale vessels, the container vessels. I'm talking the ones above 4,000 TEUs, which is actually what the exemptions, that's beyond that is where the rule kicks in for 4,000 TEU plus ships. And so we can't keep it on cost. Our labor costs are very competitive, are very hard, are not competitive. And if we do build or advance building in the US, it's going to be in the Gulf. It's not going to be in the PNW. The Gulf Coast is far more competitive with respect to labor costs, with overall costs for shipbuilding. We see a big concentration of shipyards, particularly defense contractors, but also kinds of shipyards as well, tied to the oil industry and extraction industry down in the Gulf area. So I think it's going to be really hard for the PNW to be competitive in the U.S., even if we do have, if the intent is to try to spur more growth and shipyard capacity. And then also, it's just a labor supply. I do a lot of work in the maritime sector and talk with all the shipyards. And that's the number one issue that we often hear. It's an issue that's not exclusive to shipyards. It's really manufacturing wide, but you just can't find people. I mean, these days, I mean, people with technical vocational skills like welding, you've heard this before, right? I mean, welding, painters, like industrial painters, all machinists. It's really hard to find folks. So that is often the biggest hindrance or inhibiting factor we hear about, is the fact that you just simply can't find qualified labor. And there's other factors too. Industrial lands is often compromised or challenged and threatened as well. That is necessary as well for expansion. So that's my takes on it.
Excellent. And I have to say, I got to give him points. He talked about the Gulf. He didn't say whether it was the Gulf of America or Mexico. Well done. Dan, you want to jump in?
I was just going to say though, that issue, the Chinese shipbuilding issue, and you touched on it perfectly, also is an example though where things are different this time around, because the administration put out the Section 301 and tariff. But there's also a Federal Register notice and executive order after that that has an investment strategy tied to it. So we're creating opportunity zones around our shipyards, et cetera. Now, it may not work for the reasons that you mentioned. There's also the very issue you discussed. The Secretary of Homeland Security will investigate whether Canada's ports are taking an advantage of that, have an advantage because of the harbor maintenance tax. So be ready for that rulemaking coming down the pike, right? We're going to be in that fight again. Hopefully, kind of time goes by and we kind of forget about that, because the other angle on it is just over the weekend when I had some time on the tarmac at SeaTac last night due to a little incident, which was covered wonderfully. Alaska did a great job last night, by the way. But I had some time on the tarmac, and the DOJ, they set up a separate entity for the to the U.S. maritime security policy, and there was like 10 guys put in there. They've all been DOJ'd. Right. So this strategy that we've designed on shipbuilding, none of those people are there anymore. They've all left government in the last 30 days, right, since they announced this. So I did want to just touch, though, on, I think this has to be said in the Canada-US context, given the comment earlier on fentanyl, is I would be working on tariffs all day, and then I'd come home at like 1 o'clock in the morning and watch Canadian media, because I watch more Canadian media than your average Canadian. I would just be like, dear God, in December and January, right, for all the reasons that have been mentioned. Like, but it was this craziness of the Trump administration sitting around and figuring out which prime minister they want. Is it Carney? Is it Pierre? Is it others? Like, I'm going to say, like, it's the advice you would give anybody in a relationship is, it's not about you. It's really not. I know that kills us as Canada-US people, and when you give the size and the immensity of the relationship, but it's not about Canada-US. They don't, and you heard this from the ambassador this morning, every country says they have a special relationship with the United States. And so, as we all do in Canada-US, we have to constantly do the re-education process. The problem is this group of people, and you heard it from Secretary Lutnick yesterday, feels that Canada has been screwing over the United States. Right. And they just believe that's the case, that the market's closed, et cetera. So we were very active on getting the 10% for energy when the tariffs first went on. I will tell you, on those tariffs were scheduled to go on the Saturday. We were educating the White House on Wednesday. And that's not taking anything away from the embassy. Alberta did a fantastic job. But it wasn't until we were talking to the decision makers and saying, hey, you know, we got like 3 refineries in Ohio that rely, and all the jet fuel going to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio comes from Canada, that they were like, really? And we're like, you guys negotiated USMCA. You didn't know this yet? You know, excuse my French, but you know what I mean? Like, so we were, so, I mean, those are the kind of things. So you can educate them, but they don't come to the table. So the idea that Trump didn't like Trudeau, everybody knows that, but the idea that he was like doing machinations on how do I get Carney in there versus Pierre, no, they weren't even thinking about it. And ask Japan this week, Japan, we're doing a deal. They're in an election. He's bringing that government down. You know what I mean? He doesn't care. Right. So we get too caught up in that instead of looking at what the real issue was, which was the president campaigned in the industrial Midwest where fentanyl is wiping out our population. And it's wiping out population. As somebody that has a 14-year-old, it's my biggest fear in the world is my kid taking a pill. Not because he was partying like us idiots did when we were freshmen in high school, but it's like, I got to study. And he pops the wrong thing and it's laced with fentanyl. Right. And so the president is trying to take on that. But for any of us that have done borders know this fundamental fact. You can't do something with Mexico domestically and clamp down on Mexico without clamping down on Canada, not because they're the same border, but because the politics are you're doing something for brown that you're not doing to the white Canadians. Like that's the politics in the United States. Plus, from an administrative standpoint, DHS doesn't like different policies on Mexico and Canada. They have to do one across the board. So yes, the taking out Canadian manufacturing is very real, but it's not through the fentanyl tariffs. It's through the steel and aluminum, automotive, and other tariffs. That's what we're doing. It's not the fentanyl tariffs. In fact, fentanyl tariffs have the USMCA exemption, which ain't too bad really right now. Once the USMCA exemption hit, and we fought hard for that too, it's not really impacting Canada-US trade right now. Now, I will tell you what we're hearing right now is that if there's no deal, they're pulling that exemption. And that'll be fun in August. So we have to be careful, but I think we have to be careful to always keep our sight lines on what the real issues are. Any of us that did borders said, look, and then Canada's response, well, it's only a little bit of fentanyl. And then you go out and make arrests the next week, it's like, hey, we're going to prove to you that we can do arrests behind the border. And you arrest a bunch of people in BC, OPP in Ontario had the biggest arrest ever. It's like, I thought you told us there was no fentanyl production up there. Right. Let's just accept it, say it's a problem for all three of us, and let's take care of it and then move from there. But instead, we got caught up in this nonsense and we've lost sight of what the real fight is over. That's my view.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to do a quick round and then we're going to go to questions. I have a few on HUVA, so please feel free to add some more. And we'll have questions from the audience, but I want to ask everybody. We've been talking a lot about what's going on above our heads, Canada, US, China, global. But each one of you in different ways is advising businesses and people. Minister, that was your old portfolio, people trying to figure out, I don't know what the rules are, how do I compete? So can you talk a little bit about how our firms in this region and generally are adapting to the uncertainty that's been created by these debates? I mean, it is all fun and games here, but for a lot of people, it's livelihood. So how are ordinary businesses adapting and what could we do to help?
Well, one thing I'll say right off the bat is one good thing about Trump is that he has brought Canadians together in a way that we've never come together before. And like you were saying earlier, every province is kind of their own island in Canada. And we have so many trade barriers between provinces and labor mobility issues and all of that. And we've been sitting at the table now on interprovincial trade and talking about this in a way that we never have. And so that's exciting to open up the Canadian market and to allow, people that are trained and work in one province to be able to work in another and all of that stuff. And also it's motivated every province in Canada to really look at issues around permitting and regulations and all of that. We are fast tracking projects in British Columbia now. We've created a Ministry of Infrastructure where we're looking at rather than building schools like kind of a one-off, every school district has to do their own thing. We're taking that on, managing that, and trying to build schools and to build infrastructure, to build transmission lines, to fast track critical mineral mining projects and all this stuff in a way that we've never done before. So what we're doing to support businesses is that's one thing, creating that market within Canada, and then also helping businesses diversify. We have a trade diversification strategy that we initiated a couple of years ago after the COVID and all the issues that we faced after that. And we're enhancing that strategy now. We have 50 trade and investment representatives around the world, BC does, in 14 key markets. And there's a lot of work going on right now to support that. We have programs in British Columbia, trade accelerator programs and things like that to connect businesses to the right markets, helping them go to trade shows in other countries and things like that. So there is a lot of work going on both internally within Canada and also to support businesses going to other markets. And if Trump didn't do all this stuff, we probably wouldn't be doing all this. So it's one good thing, I guess.
I'll pursue question. Are you going to open an office in DC? Because Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, now Manitoba has one.
That's a good question. Yeah, we're actually looking right now at where our trade and investment representatives are, and in the context of the new, geopolitical environment, we are looking at making changes to that. So I'll take your tip.
Excellent. Dan, you're working with firms. How are firms adapting, well and badly?
Yeah, I was just going to joke, like the headline, BC minister says Trump made Canada great again. So I bet your chief of staff will love that one. I'm kidding. Of course, I'm kidding. Of course, strike that. No, I think companies are struggling right now. Everybody's trying to figure out. I mean, there are opportunities, right? I mean, there undoubtedly there's opportunities, particularly as we lower tariff barriers around the world. But I think companies right now are in wait and see for the next month and just trying to get by until we figure this out. I think if I was going to cut a deal right now, it's kind of the flip of your earlier question. If you look at every time we have a new Canadian government or a US government, or usually it's when the US government comes in, we have a blueprint, right? Or some blueprint or a roadmap for new roadmap for Canada-US relations. And it's always kind of the same thing, just packaged in a different way. But there's a real opportunity here. I think we could go negotiate with the Trump administration and say, hey, what about saying that energy resources from Canada will be treated as domestic for our treatment, right? You need help, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. What about critical minerals, which, by the way, it's the Department of Defense that's funding a lot of the critical minerals projects in Canada right now, because the Canada's pretty risk adverse when it comes to financing those projects. But what if we could take those core pieces of the relationship, energy, critical minerals, potash, et cetera, and say both sides agree to treat those as domestic for our procurement rules and everything else. And guess what? We're still going to fight over manufacturing. Like, that would be a real solution. And you and I both worked on the roadmap last time that the last government had, and that would have been considered a win, right? That would have been considered a win if the US would have agreed and for its procurement markets to treat Canadian products as domestic. But we can't do it now, because now it'll look like 51st state kind of stuff, right? But the reality is that's where we could probably cut a deal that'll stop some of this uncertainty, is to start saying, why don't, and that would happen at the state levels as well, is the state procurement would say, we're going to treat a Canadian product as through our neighboring state agreements and those kind of things as the like. We could actually advance the puck ball, whichever sport you play, pretty well there. But the political environment, to your earlier question, that the president created doesn't leave the white space to have that really effective negotiation. But that's the answer to this problem. The challenge is within Canada, you kind of have, it's going to be energy and natural resources and ag versus manufacturing, right? And because the Trump administration is not going to give up on the manufacturing side. They just fundamentally believe that final assembly of automotive parts and other types of things should be in the United States. And you're going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to deal with it.
Excellent.
Sorry.
So, Allison, talking to businesses, the people you work with, is there a clear strategy going forward?
There's a clear strategy. Yeah, I think one of the big things right out of the gate was making sure that businesses know the stakeholders they need to be close to. So even educating businesses that, like, okay, no, finance handles tariffs, global affairs handles trade. Hurry it up. Anyway, relationships are very important. Talk to your US colleagues. You have to do this together, especially if it's a global company or a US company. And I guess one other thing that we've been saying right now is figure out how to live with some tariffs for a while, because if we can't get I don't think we can get a better deal than the UK. Like, if I don't know if we'll be the only country to have a tariff-free agreement going into the USMCA. But Canada has time now to get its game face on for the USMCA negotiations after what we've dealt with.
Excellent. All right, Spencer, have we reached the high peak of chaos and uncertainty?
I should use that as a tagline. Can I? I'll go to. The companies I talk with are all, kind of, they want to diversify. They know that China is not the outlook for U.S.-China relations, is not promising. The tariffs are not really going to go down substantially in the future. But oftentimes the things they buy, there is no other alternative. I talked to a company a while ago who buys their coaxial cables. 90% of them are manufactured. 95% are manufactured in China. So thinking about where do you go and how do you mitigate some of those costs in the future is a big challenge. But most companies, I just don't have the alternative sources to go to for the moment. You have seen a lot of companies too be sort of whiplashed by or whipsawed by the tariffs. If you look at, again, looking at containers, we had a big surge in containers the first couple months of the year, first few months of the year out of the Northwest Seaport Alliance, because everyone was trying to front load to get ahead of the tariffs. And then you saw a big drop. Last month, Northwest Seaport Alliance 20-foot equivalent unit container volumes were down almost 20%. So, a lot of companies right now, I don't know if they have a strategy, but the strategy should be certainly diversify away from China whenever possible, if they can. So.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We've run out of time, but you've been a great audience and a great panel, if I may say. Let's thank them.